There was no regulation at that time, no government regulation. Most states didn't bother with it. And at that time, they sort of blamed the problem as it developed on the Chinese. Most of the opium coming in was coming in from China. The Chinese had the opium smoking dens and what have you, and it was a major situation at that time. But as with all of these vices, the time came when the public became concerned, and just like they were concerned with liquor, that led to the prohibition. This happened with the drug use, which was unregulated. And the social workers and activists in the community started to raise the issue, and that led to the first regulation by the government of any substance, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1908. So regulation began then, in a sense. Soon, states started jumping in with laws and regulations and what have you. What we need to also focus on, because of how this developed, is who were the pool of drug users at that time? They were the street people, thieves, pimps, whores, the police characters. This was not your corporate board. This was not cocaine up on Madison Avenue. And many, many women were addicted. There was a product called laudanum, which was an elixir, and it had opium in it. And they took it for various reasons. And if they couldn't get it, their doctor would prescribe it for them. In fact, the doctors continued to be an enormous supply of opium at that time. So you have to consider the character of the pool of users that was available. It wasn't a big deal, but with regulation, as it always happens, the criminal element starts to come in, because as you suppress one thing, that need has to be fulfilled. And when it's things like alcohol or drugs or betting, sports betting, or wanting to go to the prize fights, and it's illegal, they'll make it legal.
I'm kind of curious about the 1800s Midol, for women with menstrual cramps.
Mm-hmm.
You would think, one they did a little dose in between. But now, I always think of these early days of narcotics and why it even started regulating it as a crime rather than some kind of a medical problem, because that's kind of the deal today. Wait a minute, we're not doing so well regulating this as a crime. Maybe we should look at this as a medical problem. Back then, now part of it I always thought was because what you said about it was criminals who already were wanting to take drugs and get high, and maybe use that as a substitute for alcohol. Either one will make you high, and only one of them, it smells on your breath and you start stumbling around a lot worse than maybe if you're taking some kind of opium or you're smoking opium. It seemed like they just nod out. But anyhow, be that as it may, I just wonder why. Was that like the only way they had to look at it as a law enforcement criminal issue rather than, well, these women, they seem to be needing this stuff more and more. That seems to be a problem. Shouldn't we do something medically?
Well, I can't address all of the reasonings that went behind it, but I think it's inherent in how the government approaches things. Initially, they're looking at taxing this product as a way of regulating it rather than enforcing it, or, as you say, going at it from a different direction. It was pretty much the same with alcohol. Why not treat the drunks? No, they banned alcohol. So the government sort of doesn't look from that standpoint. In fact, there was a huge argument when the next major legislation came in, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. There was a huge to-do about, well, are you people just looking to make money? You don't care about this thing. You're going about it as taxation. And they said, well, no, we're not. We're going to ban something and lose revenue if you're talking about taxation. But you can see there was this dichotomy in people feeling how it was being approached. But all I can say to it is from what I see in history, how the government approaches these type of things, vice kinds of activity, gambling, drinking, boxing, horse racing, all at one time, all they tried to do is regulate it. They never looked at any other alternatives, and usually they never had sufficient enforcement to go with it. And that's what caused a lot of the problem.
I think probably, Bill, more than likely, it's because a lot of people that are attracted to that may be kind of on the gray areas of life anyhow, that are attracted to heavy drinking, to bars, to horse race, or to gambling and prostitution and things like that. And plus there's, of course, prostitution. There's certain biblical prohibitions of things like that. But and probably narcotics use. I think of the early, in the 30s, narcotics use, you always thought of the jazz musicians and people that lived in that kind of netherworld, if you will, kind of exist in that, not in the square John world and not in the total criminal world, but kind of in between in those kinds of worlds. Maybe that may be some reason why they looked at it more as let's make this into more of a crime, and that's a way to control it.
Well, I think you have a good point there because, as I said, this pool was not a huge pool. I mean, there were a lot of narcotics users, but as I say, it wasn't the social problem that it became, where the middle class, the high class, the wealthy, the entertainment field, where, drugs became as common as a Coors Light beer. At that time, they may have thought, this is restricted to a certain element. And if we can get the doctors out of this, we can handle a lot of it. And at first, the doctors didn't comply, but then they started cracking down on them. And of course, that shorted the supply also. So gradually, we're leading to a black market. And I won't jump ahead of myself, but we'll get to the point where these entities that developed are going to take a rather modest need and they're going to grow it into something that we see in the last 50 years or so.
There's a shortage out there of this product, and there seems to be getting more and more demand, and to find more of this product, which would be an opiate at that point in time. I'm not sure where marijuana figures into this. It may or may not.
It comes later.
And so it's an opiate, and we don't really seem to grow opium poppies. That's where they come from in the United States. So that's when they start reaching out overseas, and that's when and this is a point in time when the Black Hand is setting up in your various eastern and middle west cities, which were criminal organizations with ties directly back to the Mediterranean area. And best I can tell, I know they grow a lot of poppies in Turkey and around in the Middle East. So, and they have these natural old ties, trade routes, if you will, from Sicily back into Turkey and Lebanon and around the Middle East. Is that kind of how it, would that be the genesis then of the organization of this, this product and creating a supply and bringing the supply in and then finding the customers?
Well, as this situation we talked about, we're talking about the turn of the century, the early 1900s. The Cosa Nostra doesn't exist. The Black Hand is really not coordinated or organized. They're establishing themselves, trying to get a foothold, but they're pretty much relegated to the Little Italys of the city. They can get drugs from their friends who in Italy and all that, but they're not of the ilk yet to establish really big labs over there and transporting it. And this is still the embryo stage. Now they're supplying a little bit of drugs to this small pool of ne'er-do-wells. It isn't even a big population of users yet. And then before they can really maybe organize if they're thinking about drugs, prohibition comes along. Well, now they're diverted in their interest to something way bigger than narcotics. Your pool of people who want to drink and all of the sidelights that go with alcohol was enormous. It was an enormous potential. And the mob, pretty much around the country, focused their attention on prohibition. So in this early stage, historically, the Jews in New York and other places, some of the other ethnic groups that were, they did most of the narcotics. The Italian Sicilian faction wasn't fully developed yet. Our family didn't develop until Prohibition, when all of the black hand groups came together, and they're pretty well focused on liquor, and it's huge. It's huge. In fact, the international lines of communication established through Prohibition would be used later for drugs. So at this era, it's not a big thing yet. They're dabble in it. Some of our characters who were attached to the family were arrested for narcotics. There weren't big sentences. Most of them did maybe a year, if anything. And so there wasn't any suppression of it, really. So in this early era, the narcotics trade, at least in this part of the world here, and in many other areas, was relegated to, as I say, the Jewish criminal organizations, Irish criminal organizations, and the Italians would come in later.
So this is, we're going 1933, 34 is kind of the Prohibition is winding down. When did it end? I can't remember.
1933. Let's see, it went from 20 to 33.
33, okay, that's what I thought. So, it's winding down. That's got to be a huge loss of money. Because, I mean, they could turn their speakeasies into legitimate clubs. I understand that. But you can't make near as much money off of a barrel of beer or a carton and a case of whiskey as you could before. So and I always thought of them moving more into gambling at that time, maybe even a little bit of continuing with some organized prostitution, because it was more susceptible. Prostitution is not susceptible to organization today, but back then it was more susceptible to organization. And I always thought of that, but they moved into narcotics, and particularly, what would be an example of how that would work here in Kansas City, because it would be representative in Kansas City as in every other Chicago and New York
mm-hmm.
and probably Tampa and all that, New Orleans, all the cities that had a major family would have worked the same way.
Well, yeah, because when the drug business was put on a corporate level, where they were going to not only deal with this small pool, but they were going to expand it, just as they did in Prohibition. If there were 12 bars on Main Street, they put in 40. That when they get into something, it isn't just to supply some demand, take over where someone else left off. The Cosa Nostra is like Walmart. They are going to promote their products. As you said, gambling was one of the things that they saw on the horizon. They knew the wind was in the wind that Prohibition was going to be ending. It had done its deal. The people didn't want it anymore. And so they were aware of this. In fact, they were supposed to have had a major meeting in Atlantic City in the 30s to determine where are we going to go from here. And so gambling was one of the areas they said, okay. And then we saw the plush clubs, the carpet joints, the bookie operations, the racetracks that they got into. They went in full blast. But there's always enough people to go into other directions. And one of the other directions they saw as a moneymaker and has had great potential was the narcotics industry. So and let me back up just a minute here before we get into that era. One of the main historical events of that era was in 1930, they established the Bureau of Narcotics. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established, and it was to enforce the Harrison Act from 1914. As I say, it had not been enforced to any great degree. That was